The cart trundled heavily through the muck of Smithfield. Iron-shod wheels struck against loose cobblestones, each jolt rattling the planks, and the man chained atop them. It was the 23rd of August, 1305. Summer heat hung over London like a woolen veil thick with smoke, sweat, and the stench of flesh. Around the wooden frame of the cart, soldiers flanked the condemned Sir William Wallace, once guardian of Scotland's freedom, now stripped, shackled, and silent. He had already been dragged for miles from the Tower, not walked, dragged. His body lashed down on raw timber skin, scraped against shin splinters, hands bound behind his back so tightly the cords cut through. The crowd lining the route was not quiet. They called out slurs, spat, laughed. Some jeered as if at a fairground attraction. Others remained grim, watching behind drawn brows, their children hoisted to see better over shoulders. "That's the one," someone muttered, "the one who defied the king." King Edward had ordered it personally. Treason required spectacle. Treason was not a crime against mere men. It was an affront to the crown, the divine order, the spine of empire, and punishment had to match the message. The trial had been a formality. Wallace denied the charge of treason, claiming he had never sworn loyalty to Edward. "I could not be a traitor," he had said, "for I was never his subject." But the sentence was already sealed. He would be hanged, cut down while still alive, emasculated, eviscerated, his entrails burned before his eyes, his body quartered and the pieces sent to the corners of the kingdom as tokens of obedience. Smithfield was swollen by midday. Dignitaries from France, from Flanders, from Rome's orbit had gathered to bear witness. A king's justice was a tool of diplomacy as much as rule. The gallows stood prepared. The executioner waited, face veiled not by shame but by tradition. Ropes had been tested, hooks laid out, the fire already stoked. Wallace said nothing as he was hauled from the cart. His feet dragged, his back hunched. Some say he looked skyward, others that he locked eyes with the crowd, defiant still. One monk tried to whisper a blessing. A guard struck him back. The rope tightened around his neck, and he was lifted. Legs kicked back, arched, throat spasmed, but they cut the rope too soon. He collapsed onto the scaffold, gasping, veins, bulging skin, turning purple. No mercy, not by design. Clothes were torn from him. The blade flashed. He screamed. The crowd surged forward. Some turned away. Others laughed again. Bits of food were thrown, coins, too. Children gaped in curiosity. Women bit knuckles. An old man wept. They burned his entrails before his eyes, ritual, not cruelty, or so the law claimed. His eyes rolled back before it was done. Still alive, they say, as the axe came down to sever. One limb, another, a third. The fourth took longer, bone was stubborn. Blood pooled beneath the scaffold, soaking into the summer dust. Flies gathered instantly. The smell turned. His head was dipped in tar and later set atop London Bridge. The quarters were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, visible reminders that resistance would not be tolerated, that England's reach was long and punishment longer still. Edward wanted obedience. He got myth. The crowds eventually dispersed, stepping over stains. Some whispered of the rebels' courage, others only of the horror. But none left unchanged. Officials recorded the costs, filed the records, and moved on to the next. Months passed, years, and still they spoke his name, Wallace the martyr, Wallace the lion. They did not forget, not in the glens nor the courts of Europe. The brutality intended to silence gave the rebel new breath. I have stood where he died. I have seen the shadow of the scaffold in the cobbles, and I wonder how thin the line is between law and vengeance, between justice and warning. What endures is not the king's order, but the man's silence beneath the flame. His story, torn apart yet never gone, speaks in every echo where freedom is weighed against fear. That day in Smithfield they thought they killed a man, but they created a legend, and legends, unlike bodies, do not burn. The morning held no softness. Beneath a low English sky, choked with cloud and soot, carts rolled over the wet cobblestones of Smithfield. The crowd gathered before the hour was ripe, pressing against wooden barriers with breath steaming in the air. They came from all quarters, apprentices still smelling of ale merchants, with dark cloaks tight against the damp mothers holding children aloft, and nobles mounted and silent, their horses stamping frost from the earth. This was no common hanging, it was a reckoning. William Wallace, brought down from Scotland in chains, had spent the final days in the Tower, not as a guest of diplomacy, but a condemned man tried for treason against the King of England, Edward I. To the court he had denied betrayal, claiming he owed allegiance only to Scotland. It was no defense the judges would hear. The sentence had already been decided. Hanged, drawn, and quartered. The words rang more as ritual than verdict, spoken with the gravity of law, but fashioned for spectacle and for warning. It was a punishment crafted to burn a man's rebellion out of memory, to rip his name from legend, to make an example so severe that no other soul would dare rise in defiance. The cart creaked as it emerged, bearing Wallace, hands bound and body weakened from captivity. His face was gaunt pale from days in shadow and silence, but he held his chin forward. Some in the crowd jeered, others fell silent as the whip cracked behind the cart, driving it through the mud toward Elms at Smithfield. He was tied to the hurdle, dragged not through the alleys where whispers might shelter him, but through the market road, through London's open veins, where every man, woman, and child might see him made small. By the time he reached the platform, Wallace's body had collected filth and blood in equal measure. Soldiers lifted him unceremoniously onto the wooden frame. A hush fell. The gallows rose above like a scaffolded tree, unnatural and waiting. The noose was slung over the beam. Wallace did not speak. No plea for mercy, no prayer. Only the clank of chains, the heavy breath of horses, and the crack of timber underfoot. They hanged him partially, enough to crush the wind from his throat, to darken the eyes, but not to still them. Then came the knife. He was cut down. Drawn next, his entrails hauled before the people, his agony turned outward. The executioner worked methodically, not with hatred but with duty, as though the act itself were a toll to be paid. Each phase of the sentence, hanging, disembowelment, and finally the quartering, carried its own meaning. Hanging, punishment for the crime; drawing, humiliation and the physical unmaking of treason; quartering, to divide a man limb from limb and send those parts across the realm as mute heralds of royal wrath. King Edward had not attended. He needed no audience. His presence lived in the sentence, in the method. The king's authority, imperiled by Scottish rebellion, had to be reasserted not in council or combat, but in ritual violence. It was justice by spectacle, governance by terror. A body could rebel, a quartered body could not. When Wallace's head was finally struck from the neck, a murmur went through the crowd. Some turned away, a child wept. A vendor resumed his call. Life as ever slipped forward like the carts rolling once again through Smithfield, but behind them hung the scent of blood and fire and ash. His head was taken to London Bridge, mounted in iron lips frozen in the echo of defiance. His limbs north, south, east, west were scattered to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, Perth. It was over, but even the crown could not command forgetting. Wallace's voice had fallen silent, his body undone, but stories grew in silence like roots in earth. And though the king had triumphed in flesh, the ghost of the rebel lingered in glens, in songs, in the unquiet eyes of those who had watched a man destroyed, not for who he was, but for what he dared to stand against. On a muggy August morning in 1305, the iron gates of Smithfield stirred. A crowd had begun to thicken at first light. Bakers leaned from their stalls, apprentices found excuses to linger, and children clutched their mothers' skirts, craning for a better view. Word had spread swiftly William Wallace was to die today. Not just die, but suffer the full weight of English justice, the kind saved for traitors, hanged, drawn, and quartered. He had been brought from the Tower, chained, filthy, and half-starved, dragged the 2 miles behind horses on a wooden hurdle. His face, bloodied but set, remained unturned as jeers flew from the mob. Men spat at him, women shouted curses, and yet a few stood silent. They remembered him not as an outlaw, but as the man who had bested English knights at Stirling Bridge, who had defied a king and crowned a cause with defiance. To them his gaze still bore the charge of defiance. But now he was condemned. King Edward I had made his decision weeks earlier. Wallace stripped of noble title and condemned not as a soldier, but as a common criminal, was to be made an example of. The sentence passed at Westminster had been exacting, precise, first to hang, but not to die, then to be cut down still breathing. His body opened, his entrails burned before his eyes, and finally to be dismembered, his limbs scattered to the corners of the realm. Such was the king's decree. Treason must not merely be punished, it must be seen, remembered, and feared. No battlefield had broken Wallace, thus the law would. A pageantry of pain, a theater of authority. At the scaffold, the priest mumbled final rites. Wallace, barely able to stand, refused to confess guilt. "I committed no treason," he murmured, "against a king I never swore fealty to." Whether many heard him over the roar is uncertain, but the executioner paused just for a breath. The rope jerked tight. His body convulsed as the crowd roared approval, then horror. The executioner, a practiced hand, cut the noose before death came. Wallace fell limp but alive. Men held him fast as the blade opened his belly. He did not cry out. A soldier later whispered he saw tears stream silently down the rebel's face, not of fear, but of fury. The fire was lit. Organs pulled out by bloodied hands sizzled on the flames. The stench drove many to retch. Some turned away, others leaned forward as if proximity to this agony brought them closer to the power it represented. The final act, limbs severed, head removed, was mechanical now. There was no ceremony in the end, only gore. His head tarred and fixed upon London Bridge grinned down for months. His arms and legs rode with messengers to Newcastle, Berwick, Perth, and Stirling. Each city would know what became of defiance. The king had ensured it. Yet for all the ritual, for all the pain, something in the man had remained untouched. Wallace, they said, had not pleaded, had not begged. In death as in war, he gave the English no satisfaction, and still they came to look. Years later, men and women would stop at the bridge, gaze up at the blackened skull, and whisper his name, not as traitor, as something else entirely. The cart rumbled over uneven stones as they hauled him through the heart of London. People lined the streets not with pity, but with curiosity. Some jeered, others stood quiet, children lifted onto shoulders, old men leaning on sticks. William Wallace lay bound, limbs stiff from hours in chains, his body torn already from confinement. Iron scraped his skin where shackles had worn through flesh. The smell of sweat, blood, and filth clung to him, thickened by the summer heat. He raised his head only once to glimpse the tower spires not far now from Smithfield, where the sentence would be carried out. They said he had betrayed the king, not the king of his people, but Edward of England, who now sat secure upon a throne built on conquest. Treason, they declared, for raising arms, for leading men, for daring to imagine Scotland might stand free. For this he was to endure a death made public, a warning etched not just in blood, but in the memory of every soul who watched. He had been judged in Westminster Hall. There, surrounded by nobles, clerics, and sheriffs, Wallace stood silent as the charges were read aloud. No defense was permitted, no counsel, no mitigation. The sentence had already been written long before the trial. Edward's voice was not needed in the chamber. His judgment echoed through the clerk, who delivered it with slow, deliberate tone. Wallace would be drawn to the place of execution, hanged, until near death, emasculated, disemboweled, beheaded, and quartered. Each part of the sentence announced with a pause, as if the ritual cruelty demanded its own rhythm. The cart halted. He was dragged down ropes biting into his flesh. They tied his arms behind him and tethered his ankles to the tail of a horse. The crowd murmured and shifted as the procession moved forward. Dust rose from the wheels. A priest walked nearby, murmuring Latin verses. Wallace said nothing. His mouth was parched, throat dry, tongue swollen. He had not eaten in 2 days. His heart pounded not from fear, but from the effort of breathing through pain. At Smithfield, the scaffold had been prepared high, brutal, uncompromising. Wooden timbers stained from previous use, rope dangling a basket below to catch the head. Above it, a placard, "Traitor to the Crown." They lifted him roughly, forcing him upright. His knees buckled. He caught sight of the block and the executioner, leather-aproned face, unreadable. The hangman moved in, looping the rope. With a practiced hand, he checked the knots. The sheriff called out for order. Then the signal was given. He hung there long enough to blacken the face, to bulge the eyes, to let the world blur and drift, but not long enough to die. They cut him down. Air rushed into his lungs like fire, and then the next phase began. They tore open his garments. A blade was drawn, and what followed unfolded before a crowd still watching. Some turned their eyes. Others did not. It was not spectacle alone. It was law. It was deterrence. It was Edward's justice made flesh and flayed in front of the people. When it was done, they took his head. One stroke, then another. It did not come easily. The axeman wiped his brow. Blood pooled on the scaffold, soaking into straw. The head was raised for all to see. "Behold the head of a traitor," someone cried, voice cracking over the silence that followed. 4 quarters were taken away, sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth cities, where rebellion still stirred, where memory still lived. His head was boiled and set upon London Bridge. There it remained above the flow of the Thames, an emblem of defeat. People passed beneath it, and over time it became part of the city's breath. The warning carried in smoke and sermon, in edict and rumor. William Wallace had no tomb. No grave bore his name. But in the hearts of many who had watched in the faces that had gone pale that day, something deeper remained. Not just horror, not just fear, but the bitter, relentless knowledge of what power looked like when it wore a crown and called it order.